In 2006, you could ride a bus from Chicago to Cincinnati for a single dollar. 300 miles, $1. Millions of Americans took that deal, and the company selling those tickets looked like it should have been printing money. Instead, in the summer of 2024, it filed for bankruptcy, owing creditors as much as $500 million. So, what happened to America's dollar bus? To understand the dollar bus, you have to understand how grim American bus travel had become by the early 2000s. For most of the 20th century, the intercity bus was how working America moved. If you couldn't afford a car or a plane ticket, you took the bus, and the bus meant Greyhound. But by the early 2000s, that name carried weight of a different kind. Ridership had been sliding for years. The terminals, once busy hubs in the center of town, had aged into something people tried to avoid. Many sat in the worst part of downtown, fluorescent lit, the air thick with diesel and the hiss of brakes, a waiting room full of people who had run out of cheaper options. The bus had become the ride of last resort. Therefore, almost nobody was looking at it as a business worth reinventing. A few people were. On the East Coast, something strange was happening on the curb. Small operators running between the Chinatowns of New York and Boston had figured out that if you skipped the terminal entirely, picked passengers up on the sidewalk, and ran lean, you could sell a ticket for $15 and still fill every seat. They were rough around the edges, but they proved a point. The demand for cheap intercity travel was still out there, as strong as ever. Somebody just had to serve it. Across the Atlantic, a Scottish company was watching the same idea from a very different angle. Stagecoach Group was one of the largest transport operators in Britain, built by an ambitious entrepreneur named Brian Suter, who had a habit of attacking markets on price. In 2003, Stagecoach launched a new brand in the UK called Megabus.com. It started small in Scotland, with just 3 coaches. The pitch was simple. Book online, skip the station, and grab a seat for £1 if you booked early enough. It borrowed its whole pricing philosophy from the budget airlines. A handful of seats on every coach went for almost nothing, and the price climbed as the bus filled and the travel date got closer. The early birds rode for pocket change. Everyone else still paid less than the train. In Britain, it worked almost immediately. And here's where the two worlds connect. Stagecoach didn't just operate buses in Scotland. It already owned a sprawling American subsidiary called Coach USA, a patchwork of bus companies stitched together across the states. So the Scots looked across the ocean at a country with cheap fuel, long distances between major cities, millions of students, and an incumbent in Greyhound that had spent years giving people reasons to stay home. They saw an open lane. The plan was to take the megabus model, the curbside stops, the online booking, the fares that started at a single dollar, and drop it into the middle of America to see what would happen. The decision seemed small at the time. It would end up reshaping how an entire country thought about the cheapest way to travel. In the spring of 2006, they picked their first city. On April 10th, 2006, Megabus.com began service in the United States. The first city was Chicago. There was no grand terminal, no ribbon cutting. The buses simply pulled up to a stretch of curb beside Chicago's Union Station and loaded passengers off the sidewalk. From there, they ran out to a ring of Midwestern cities: Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Louis. You booked your seat online, you showed up at the curb, you got on the bus. That was the entire experience. And a few of those seats, on every single departure, cost $1. Here's the part that confused people. How can a real company, with real drivers and real diesel and real insurance, sell a 300-mile ride for the price of a gumball? The answer is that almost nobody actually paid $1. Megabus ran its pricing straight out of the budget airline playbook. On any given bus, only a small number of seats were released at that headline price, usually the first ones booked, weeks out. As the departure date got closer and the bus filled up, the fare climbed. A few early birds rode for $1. The next group paid $5, then $10, then $20. The person booking the night before paid the most. But here's the thing the company understood that the public didn't. Even the most expensive Megabus seat was still cheaper than Greyhound, and far cheaper than the train. In those early Midwest markets, the top fare on a long trip ran somewhere in the low 40s. The dollar seat was the bait. The rest of the bus was the business. The reason that worked came down to a single idea. Marginal cost. Once a bus is scheduled to leave at 9 in the morning, it is going to make that trip whether it carries 10 passengers or 60. The driver is paid either way. The fuel is burned either way. So the cost of adding one more passenger to a seat that would otherwise go empty is almost nothing. Therefore, even $1 is profit, as long as the rest of the coach is paying real money. Fill the bus with a spread of fares, from $1 at the bottom to the low 40s at the top, and the average ride still clears a margin. And Megabus had stripped its costs to the bone to make that math work. No terminals meant no terminal leases, no terminal staff, no terminal upkeep. The curb was free. Selling online meant no ticket counters and no storefronts. And because the whole thing sat inside Stagecoach, one of the largest bus operators on Earth, it could lean on existing scale instead of building everything from scratch. The company had engineered a machine with very little fat on it. Then it leaned into comfort, which nobody expected from a budget bus. Megabus rolled out tall double-decker coaches with big panoramic windows, power outlets, and free Wi-Fi at a time when Wi-Fi on the move still felt like a novelty. The bus that was supposed to be the ride of last resort suddenly had a better view than first class on the train. The riders came fast, students heading home for the weekend, young professionals priced out of flying, people who simply could not believe the number on the screen and booked a trip just to see if it was real. But that beautiful, lean machine had a weakness baked into its design, and it was hiding in plain sight. A business with almost no fat has almost no cushion. When every dollar is accounted for and the margins are razor thin by design, the model only survives as long as the buses stay full and the costs stay low. Take either one away, and there is nothing left to absorb the blow. For now, though, the buses were full, and Megabus was about to go national. The Midwest experiment did not stay an experiment for long. Within about 2 years of that first Chicago departure, Megabus had carried roughly 1 million passengers. That is the kind of number that turns a pilot project into a strategy. So Stagecoach did the obvious thing. It poured money into more coaches, those tall double-deckers, and it started looking at the map of America the way a chess player looks at an open board. The model it used was hub and spoke, the same shape an airline draws. Pick a major city, plant a curbside stop, and run buses out to every mid-sized city within a day's drive. Chicago had proven the idea in the Midwest. Now the company went hunting for the next hub, but the expansion was not a clean straight line, and the first real stumble came early. In 2007, barely a year in, Megabus pushed onto the West Coast, into California and Arizona. It looked like a natural fit. Big cities, long distances, plenty of students. Except the riders did not show up the way they had in the Midwest. The West was built around the car in a way the Midwest college corridors were not, and the routes bled money. By 2008, Megabus pulled out of the region almost entirely. It was a small failure in a story that was mostly winning, easy to wave off at the time, but it was the first sign that the dollar bus magic did not work everywhere automatically. The map had limits. The company would relearn that lesson the hard way years later. For now, though, it shook off the West Coast and kept building where the math worked. Through the late 2000s and into the 2010s, the hubs multiplied. Atlanta came online in late 2011, opening up a web of routes across the South to cities like Nashville, Birmingham, and Orlando. Texas followed in 2012, with Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio anchoring a new network. California came back that same year, this time approached more carefully. Hub by hub, the curbside dollar bus spread until it touched hundreds of cities across the country. You could hear the change before you saw it. On a sidewalk that used to be just a sidewalk, a double-decker would swing in, air brakes letting go with a long hiss, and a line of 40 people with backpacks and duffel bags would start shuffling toward the door. There was no terminal and no gate, just a bus and a curb and a fare that started at $1. Therefore, the competition could not ignore it. The biggest answer came in 2008, when Greyhound, the very incumbent Megabus, had been undercutting, teamed up with Peter Pan Bus Lines to launch a rival called Bolt Bus. Same idea. Curbside stops, online booking, and yes, a handful of $1 seats on every bus. For a while, the Northeast corridor between cities like New York, Boston, and Washington turned into a genuine price war, with two budget operators racing each other to the bottom of the fare chart. Riders won. They got cheaper, nicer buses with Wi-Fi up and down the East Coast. and the scale of the shift is easy to miss. In just a few years, a Scottish company and its American copycats had quietly rebuilt the bottom end of American travel. The intercity bus, the ride of last resort, the thing people had spent a decade trying to avoid, had become the smart, cheap, slightly cool way for a generation to get around. Curbside boarding went from a Chinatown oddity to the industry standard. Megabus was no longer a clever idea from Scotland. It was an institution. And institutions, once they get big enough and profitable enough, tend to attract a very particular kind of attention, the kind that arrives with spreadsheets. For more than a decade, Megabus belonged to Stagecoach, a bus company run by people who, whatever else you think of them, fundamentally understood buses. Then, in 2019, that changed. Stagecoach sold Coach USA, and Megabus along with it, to a private equity firm called Variant Equity Advisors. The price was around $271 million. And the way deals like this usually work matters enormously to what happened next. Private equity does not typically buy a company with its own cash and let it ride. It borrows heavily to make the purchase, then loads that borrowed money onto the company it just bought. The business itself becomes responsible for paying back the debt that was used to acquire it. So a firm can buy something, and the thing it bought ends up carrying the loan. Remember the weakness built into Megabus from the very beginning. A machine with almost no fat has almost no cushion. The whole model survived on thin margins and full buses, with nothing to spare. Therefore, the worst possible thing you could do to a business like that is bolt a heavy debt payment onto it every single month. That is exactly what the buyout did. By the time the story reached its end, Coach USA was carrying nearly $198 million in debt tied to that 2019 deal. The lean little machine that used to run on next to nothing now woke up every morning owing money it had never spent. For a while, the buses kept rolling, and the fares stayed cheap, and most riders never felt the difference. The clock was ticking quietly underneath it all. Nobody could hear it yet. Then came 2020. When the pandemic hit, the entire premise of Megabus evaporated overnight. The business was built on packing strangers shoulder to shoulder into a sealed metal tube for 6 hours. In the spring of 2020, that went from a bargain to the last thing on earth anyone wanted to do. Ridership cratered almost overnight. The company later reported that its revenue dropped by around 60% in 2020. By 2021, ridership was running at roughly a quarter of what it had been before the pandemic. And here is where that hidden weakness finally mattered. A normal company with healthy margins and cash in reserve can survive a terrible year. It tightens its belt, draws on savings, and waits for the storm to pass. But Megabus was never built with a belt to tighten. The margins were thin by design, and now there was a $198 million debt sitting on top of them. There was no reserve, because the entire genius of the model had been to eliminate anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The cushion the company never had was now the only thing that could have saved it. And the recovery, when it came slowly. By 2023, ridership had only clawed back to roughly half of where it started. On top of that, the whole industry was struggling to hire and keep drivers, so even the demand that did return was hard to fully serve. So picture the machine now. Fewer passengers in the seats, higher costs to run every route, a crushing monthly debt payment that existed for one reason, to pay back the people who had bought the company. The dollar seat was still there on the website, a ghost of the original promise, but the business underneath it was quietly failing. The buses that had spent 15 years proving that cheap travel could work were now losing money on almost every trip. There was really only one place this could end, and in the summer of 2024, Megabus arrived there. On June 11th, 2024, Coach USA filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Delaware. The filing laid it out plainly. The company listed liabilities somewhere between $100 and $500 million. It blamed a collapse in ridership it had never fully recovered from after the pandemic, and it pointed directly at the debt from that 2019 private equity buyout as a weight it could no longer carry. 18 years, almost to the month after that first dollar bus pulled away from the curb in Chicago, the company behind it ran out of road. But Chapter 11 is not the end of the line. It is a tool for selling off what is valuable and walking away from what is not. So the company's pieces went up for auction, sold off one by one to keep the wheels turning. The Megabus brand itself, the name, the roots, the intellectual property, was bought by an affiliate of the Renko Group, a private holding company. The commuter lines went to other operators. The empire that Stagecoach had stitched together was broken up and sold off in pieces. And here's the strange thing. The buses never stopped. If you go online today, Megabus is still there. You can still book a curbside seat in dozens of cities. Still find a fare that starts at $1 if you book early enough. The brand outlived the company that bankrupted itself buying it. It just runs under new owners now, a smaller, quieter version of the machine that once reshaped how a country traveled. Because that is the real legacy here, and it is worth being honest about. Megabus did not fail, because the idea was bad. The idea was a genuine breakthrough. It dragged the American intercity bus out of the gutter and made cheap travel feel modern. It proved that curbside boarding worked, that yield pricing worked on the ground the same way it worked in the air, that millions of people would happily ride a bus if you simply made it cheap and easy. Look at the budget bus market today, at the operators who picked up where it left off, and you are looking at the world Megabus built. The innovation survived. The company did not. What killed America's dollar bus was never the dollar. The fare did exactly what it was designed to do for nearly 2 decades. What killed it was a mountain of borrowed money, bolted onto a business that was engineered, from its very first day, to have nothing left over. Today, the dollar bus lives on in a quieter form. The fare is still out there for anyone patient enough to hunt for it, booked weeks ahead, claimed by the early birds the way it always was. Students still ride home on it. Budget travelers still swear by it. And on the corners of certain cities, a double-decker still swings up to a bare stretch of curb, air brakes hissing, and a line of people with backpacks still shuffles aboard exactly the way they did back in 2006. There is a small irony here. The dollar seat was always a kind of magic trick, a loss leader designed to pull you in so the rest of the bus could turn a profit. It was never really the point, and yet it became the thing people remembered, the number that made them believe travel could be almost free. The company broke for an entirely different reason. People who cared about balance sheets had gotten hold of a business that only ever cared about filling seats. The bus did its job to the very end. The math behind it is the part that finally gave out. If you rode the dollar bus back in its prime, do me a favor and drop the route you took in the comments. The Chicago corridors, the overnight hauls, the trip you booked just to see if a dollar fare was actually real. I'd love to read them.